The sweat-stained concrete floor of Murphy's boxing gym had seen countless fighters fall, but nobody expected the quiet woman in worn sneakers to be the one who would rewrite every assumption they held about strength, skill, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Sarah Martinez walked into that gym on a rainy Tuesday evening, looking like any other office worker seeking a workout routine. Her petite frame, gentle smile, and soft-spoken demeanor fooled everyone. The regulars barely glanced her way as she signed the waiver and paid for her first session. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would become legend in their small community. What happened next in that dimly lit gym would expose years of hidden training, reveal secrets that had been buried in classified files, and prove that the most dangerous fighters often come in the most unexpected packages. This is the true story of how one woman's past collided with her present, turning an ordinary evening at a neighborhood boxing gym into an extraordinary demonstration of skills that few civilians would ever see. The men who thought they could intimidate her had no idea they were about to face someone who had survived training that breaks most people before they even begin. They were about to learn that some fights are won before the first punch is ever thrown, and that the deadliest weapons are often hidden behind the kindest eyes. Sarah Martinez pushed through the heavy glass door of Murphy's boxing gym, the familiar scent of leather, sweat, and determination hitting her immediately. The October rain had soaked through her lightweight jacket, and water dripped from her dark hair onto the worn welcome mat. At 32, she possessed an understated presence that most people overlooked completely. Standing just 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slender build, Sarah looked more like a kindergarten teacher than someone seeking combat training. The gym buzzed with its usual evening crowd. Heavy bags swayed under relentless punishment while jump ropes whipped through the air in steady rhythms. Grunts and the sharp crack of gloves against leather created a symphony of controlled aggression. Near the ring, a group of men in their 20s and 30s worked through combinations, their movements sharp and confident. They carried themselves with the swagger that comes from knowing you can handle yourself in a fight. Murphy himself stood behind the front counter, a grizzled man in his 60s, whose weathered face told stories of countless battles both inside and outside the ring. His gym had been a neighborhood institution for over 20 years, attracting everyone from weekend warriors to semi-professional fighters. When Sarah approached, he barely looked up from his clipboard. "First time?" Murphy asked, his Brooklyn accent thick with decades of cigarettes and shouting instructions over the noise of training sessions. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice soft but clear. She pulled a folded $20 bill from her pocket. "I'd like to try a beginner's class." Murphy finally lifted his eyes, taking in her appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen thousands of hopefuls walk through his doors. Her clothes were simple and practical dark jeans, a plain grey t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. No designer athletic wear, no expensive accessories, nothing that screamed serious athlete or wealthy dilettante looking for a trendy workout. "You sure about this, lady?" Murphy asked, not unkindly. "This ain't some cardio kickboxing class. We do real boxing here. Real contact, real training." Sarah nodded, maintaining steady eye contact. "I understand. I'm looking for something more challenging than a regular gym. Fair enough." Murphy shrugged and slid a waiver across the counter. "Fill this out. Emergency contact, medical conditions, all that legal stuff. Class starts in 15 minutes. Tommy over there will get you some gloves." He gestured towards a young man with close-cropped hair and arms covered in tattoos. Tommy was wrapping his hands near a speed bag, his movements quick and efficient. When Murphy called him over, he jogged across the gym with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his environment. "Tommy, this is..." Murphy glanced at the waiver Sarah was filling out. "Sarah. She's trying out the beginner class. Get her set up." Tommy looked Sarah up and down, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "You ever boxed before?" "A little," Sarah said, which was technically true, though it didn't begin to capture the full scope of her training. "Cool. Let me grab you some gloves and wraps." Tommy headed toward a wall lined with equipment. Fair warning though, Coach Davidson can be pretty intense, even with beginners. He believes in throwing people in the deep end to see if they swim. As Sarah waited, she took in more details of the gym. The walls were covered with fight posters spanning decades, from Muhammad Ali to modern champions she didn't recognize. A trophy case in the corner displayed awards won by Murphy's fighters over the years. The equipment was well used but well maintained, showing the care of people who respected their tools. Coach Davidson emerged from a back office, and Sarah understood immediately what Tommy meant about intensity. He was a compact man in his 40s, with the kind of muscle that comes from functional training rather than bodybuilding. His eyes swept the gym like a general surveying troops, missing nothing. When his gaze landed on Sarah, it lingered for just a moment before moving on. "All right, beginners, let's go," Davidson called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise effortlessly. "You know the drill. 5-minute warm-up, then we're working fundamentals." Sarah joined 3 other newcomers near the ring. There was Marcus, a college student who kept adjusting his expensive gear. Jenny, a woman in her late 20s who mentioned she was training for fitness. And Derek, a man in his 30s who had the soft look of someone who spent too much time behind a desk but talked loudly about wanting to learn self-defense. "Jumping jacks, let's go," Davidson shouted, and the group began moving. Sarah fell into the rhythm easily, her movements controlled and efficient. While the others huffed and showed signs of strain after 2 minutes, she maintained steady breathing and perfect form. Davidson noticed but didn't comment, instead focusing his attention on correcting Marcus's technique and encouraging Jenny to push through her fatigue. After warming up, Davidson led them through basic stance work. "Boxing starts with your feet," he explained, demonstrating the proper position. "Everything else builds from here. If your foundation is wrong, everything else falls apart." Sarah slipped into a southpaw stance naturally, her left foot forward, weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Her posture was textbook perfect, with her guard high and her body turned at the correct angle. The muscle memory was so ingrained that she didn't even think about it. "Not bad," Davidson said, walking past her. "You're a lefty?" "Yes, sir." "Most people struggle with stance at first. You pick things up quick." They moved on to basic punches, starting with the jab. Davidson demonstrated the technique, emphasizing the importance of rotating the fist and extending fully. "It's not about power at first," he explained. "It's about precision and form. Power comes later." Sarah threw her first jab at the heavy bag Tommy had positioned for her, and something shifted in the atmosphere around her. The punch landed with a crisp snap that spoke of countless hours of practice. Her form was flawless, from the twist of her hips to the snap of her wrist at impact. The bag barely moved, but the sound was distinctly different from the other beginners' efforts. Several of the experienced fighters had stopped their own training to watch the newcomers. As was tradition when beginners worked out, it was partly entertainment and partly a way to scout potential talent or sparring partners. When Sarah threw that first jab, heads turned. "Do that again," Davidson said, moving closer. Sarah repeated the movement, this time flowing into a straight left cross. The combination was smooth and powerful, executed with the kind of muscle memory that comes only from extensive training. The heavy bag, which weighed at least 80 pounds, swayed noticeably from the impact. "Where did you say you trained before?" Davidson asked, his tone more interested now. "I didn't say," Sarah replied quietly, setting up for another combination. Davidson studied her more carefully. Her footwork was exceptional, her breathing controlled, and her recovery between punches was nearly instantaneous. These weren't the movements of someone who had taken a few cardio boxing classes at a chain gym. This was real training, extensive and recent. Meanwhile, Derek was struggling with the basic jab, his punches wild and uncontrolled. Marcus was better, but clearly overthinking every movement. Jenny was game, but obviously new to any kind of combat sport. The contrast between them and Sarah was becoming more apparent with each minute. "Let's try some combinations," Davidson announced. "Jab, cross, hook. Take your time, focus on form." Sarah flowed through the combination like water, each punch setting up the next in perfect sequence. Her left hook in particular was a thing of beauty, her body rotating from the ground up, generating power through proper technique rather than muscle alone. The sound of her gloves hitting the bag drew more attention from around the gym. Tommy paused in his own workout and wandered over. "Damn," he said quietly to Davidson. "She's got some serious technique." Davidson nodded, watching Sarah work through the combination again. "More than technique. Look at her conditioning, she's not even breathing hard." It was true. While the other beginners were clearly fatigued, Sarah maintained perfect form and steady breathing. Her movements had the efficiency that comes from training designed to conserve energy while maximizing effectiveness. Every motion had a purpose, with no wasted effort or unnecessary flourishes. The session continued with defensive work, focusing on basic blocking and head movement. Davidson demonstrated how to slip punches and create angles, emphasizing that avoiding damage was just as important as inflicting it. "The best fighters are the ones who take the least punishment," he explained. Sarah's defensive movements were even more impressive than her offense. She seemed to anticipate Davidson's demonstrations, her head moving out of the line of fire before he had fully committed to the motion. Her blocks were precise and efficient, designed to deflect rather than simply absorb impact. "Partner up for some light technical sparring," Davidson called out. "Just working on what we covered today. No power, just technique." The other beginners looked nervous, but Sarah simply nodded and looked around for a partner. Davidson gestured for her to work with him, curious to see more of what she could do. They touched gloves and began moving in a slow, technical pace. Davidson threw gentle jabs and crosses, focusing on giving Sarah opportunities to practice her defensive work. But what happened next surprised even him. Sarah didn't just block or slip his punches. She countered with lightning-fast combinations that stopped just short of contact. Her counterpunching was sophisticated, showing an understanding of timing and distance that typically took years to develop. She found openings that most beginners wouldn't even see, much less exploit. Her movement in the ring was fluid and purposeful, never backing up in a straight line, always maintaining proper angles. "That's enough," Davidson said after a few minutes, but there was respect in his voice now. "Very nice work." The other gym members had gradually stopped their own training to watch. Sarah's performance had been so far above beginner level that it was impossible to ignore. Conversations buzzed around the gym as people tried to figure out where she had trained and why she was in a beginner's class. As the session wound down, Davidson approached Sarah while she was unwrapping her hands. "I have to ask," he said, "what's your background?" "That wasn't beginner-level boxing." Sarah looked up at him, considering her words carefully. "I've had some training." "Some training?" Davidson laughed. "Lady, I've been coaching for 15 years. I know what some training looks like, and that wasn't it. You move like a pro." Around them, the gym was returning to its normal rhythm, but several people continued to glance in Sarah's direction. Word was already spreading about the newcomer who had shown up looking like a soccer mom and boxed like a champion. Sarah finished wrapping her hand wraps and stood up. "I'm just looking for a good workout and a chance to stay sharp. This seems like a good gym for that." "Stay sharp for what?" Davidson pressed. "Are you competing somewhere? Are you a trainer yourself?" "Something like that," Sarah replied evasively. She pulled her jacket back on, the rain outside having intensified while they trained. "Same time next week?" "Absolutely. But next week, you're not in the beginner's class. You'll work with the intermediate group at least." Sarah nodded and headed for the door, leaving behind a gym full of people with questions. Murphy watched her go, then turned to Davidson. "What do you think?" the old gym owner asked. Davidson shook his head slowly. "I think we just met someone with a very interesting past. That kind of training doesn't come from weekend classes. She's been through something serious." Tommy joined the conversation, having finished his own workout. "Think she's a cop? Maybe military?" "Could be," Davidson mused, "but I've trained plenty of cops and soldiers. This was different. More refined, more specialized." Outside, Sarah walked through the rain toward her car, a modest sedan that drew no attention in the gym's parking lot. She had enjoyed the workout more than she expected, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of training and the honest simplicity of physical exertion. For an hour, she had been able to focus entirely on the present moment, letting muscle memory and instinct take over. What she hadn't expected was how much attention her skills would draw, even when she was holding back significantly. The performance she had just given was merely a shadow of her true capabilities, carefully controlled to avoid raising too many questions. But even that restrained demonstration had been enough to mark her as something unusual in Murphy's gym. As she drove home through the darkened streets, Sarah reflected on the evening. She had been looking for a place to maintain her conditioning and skills without the intensity and scrutiny of her previous life. Murphy's gym had seemed perfect for that purpose, a neighborhood establishment where she could blend in and train quietly. But blending in was proving more difficult than anticipated. Years of training had left their mark on her, creating patterns of movement and levels of skill that were impossible to completely hide. The question now was whether she could find a way to train seriously while maintaining the low profile she desperately needed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "How was the gym?" "Did you punch someone?" Sarah smiled slightly as she typed back. "It was fine. Just a workout." But as she pulled into her apartment complex, she knew that her simple workout had been anything but fine. She had revealed more of herself than intended, and in a place where gossip traveled fast, and people paid attention to anything unusual. Tomorrow, word of her performance would spread beyond the gym, carried by the fighters who trained there and shared stories in other venues around the city. For someone who needed to remain invisible, tonight had been a significant mistake. But for someone who had spent years hiding her true self, the feeling of moving freely and using her skills had been intoxicating. The question was whether she could find a balance between the two needs, or if she would have to choose between safety and the chance to be who she really was. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit boxing community. By Thursday morning, 3 different fighters from Murphy's gym had called their friends at other venues, describing the mysterious woman who had shown up for a beginner's class and moved like a seasoned professional. The story grew slightly with each telling, as boxing stories always did, but the core facts remained the same. Someone with serious skills was training at Murphy's under an assumed level. Sarah was unaware of this growing interest as she went through her normal routine. Her day job as a freelance technical writer kept her busy and provided the perfect cover for someone who needed flexibility and minimal scrutiny. She worked from her small apartment, taking on projects that allowed her to pay rent while maintaining the low profile that had become essential to her survival. Her apartment reflected the same understated approach as her appearance. The furniture was functional but unremarkable, the kind you could buy at any discount store. The only hints of her true background were carefully hidden: a small, locked case in her bedroom closet, and a few books on combat psychology and military tactics mixed in with innocuous technical manuals. When Friday evening arrived, Sarah felt the familiar pull of anticipation as she prepared for her second visit to Murphy's gym. The previous session had felt like waking up after a long sleep, reconnecting with a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. Despite her concerns about drawing attention, she needed the outlet that physical training provided. She arrived at the gym to find a different atmosphere than the previous Tuesday. The usual crowd was there, but there was an undercurrent of expectation, as if people were waiting for something interesting to happen. Several fighters she hadn't seen before were warming up, and she noticed more eyes following her movement as she signed in and paid for the session. Murphy himself was more attentive this time, looking up from his paperwork as she approached the counter. "Back for more punishment?" he asked with a slight grin. "Something like that," Sarah replied, matching his casual tone. "Davidson's got you with the intermediate group tonight. They're a good crew, been training together for a while. Should be more your speed." Sarah nodded and headed to the changing area, noting the way conversations seemed to pause slightly as she walked past. The attention was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to notice such things. She was becoming known, which was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. The intermediate group was indeed different from the beginners she had worked with previously. These were people who had been boxing for months or years, with the confidence and conditioning that came from regular training. They moved with purpose and efficiency, their techniques polished enough to be effective, but not so advanced as to be intimidating to newcomers. Davidson introduced her to the group without much fanfare. "This is Sarah. She'll be training with you guys from now on. She's got some experience, so don't take it easy on her." There were 8 people in the intermediate class, ranging in age from early 20s to mid-40s. Most were men, but 2 other women trained regularly with the group. Sarah appreciated that the introductions were brief and focused on training rather than personal history. "We're working combinations tonight," Davidson announced. 3 minutes on, 1 minute rest, 6 rounds. Start with jab cross hook, then we'll add some footwork. The heavy bags were arranged around the gym, each participant claiming their usual spot. Sarah found herself next to a woman named Lisa, a nurse in her 30s who had been boxing for 2 years. On her other side was Carlos, a mechanic who treated boxing like a second job, training 5 days a week with religious dedication. "First time with the group?" Lisa asked as she wrapped her hands. "Second time at the gym," Sarah replied. "Coach thought I'd fit better here." Carlos overheard and looked over with interest. "Tommy mentioned you had some serious technique." "Where'd you train before?" "Here and there," Sarah said, focusing on her hand wraps to avoid the intensity of his gaze. "Different gyms, different places." It was a non-answer, but Carlos was too polite to press further. The timer buzzed, and conversation ceased as everyone began working on the bags. Sarah settled into the rhythm of 3-minute rounds, the familiar pattern helping her find focus. But as the session progressed, she realized that hiding her skills among this group would be even more difficult than with the beginners. The intermediate fighters had enough experience to recognize sophisticated technique when they saw it, and they were more likely to ask pointed questions. Her combinations flowed with the kind of precision that came from thousands of repetitions under expert instruction. While the others worked hard and showed solid fundamentals, Sarah moved with an economy of motion that spoke of training designed for real-world application rather than sport. Every punch served multiple purposes, setting up the next attack while maintaining defensive awareness. Davidson watched the class with his usual attention to detail, offering corrections and encouragement as needed. But Sarah noticed his eyes lingering on her more frequently, studying her movement patterns and technique with growing curiosity. During the rest period between rounds, Carlos struck up conversation again. "You move like you've done some serious competition. Golden gloves? Any amateur tournaments?" "Nothing official," Sarah replied, which was technically true. Her competitions had been of a very different nature. "Well, you've got natural talent then," Lisa chimed in. "I've been doing this for 2 years and I still don't move that smoothly." The timer buzzed again, saving Sarah from further questions, but she could sense the increased attention her answers were generating. The group was friendly, but observant, and her evasiveness was starting to stand out as much as her boxing skills. The session continued with defensive drills, focusing on slip and counter techniques. Davidson demonstrated the basic movements, showing how to avoid the jab and respond with a cross-counter. It was fundamental boxing, the kind of skill that separated trained fighters from people who simply threw punches. Sarah's defensive work was even more impressive than her offense. She seemed to anticipate punches before they were fully committed. Her head movement minimal but perfectly timed. When working with partners for light technical sparring, she made experienced fighters look slow and predictable. Tommy, who had helped her with equipment on her first night, was her partner for one of the drills. As they worked through the exercise, his expression grew more puzzled. "Okay, I have to ask," he said during a break. "Where did you really train? Because that defensive work is way beyond anything you pick up in regular classes." Sarah hesitated, aware that near people were listening to the conversation.
"I've had some specialized instruction."
"Specialized how?" Tommy pressed. "Military? Law enforcement?" The questions were getting more specific, more dangerous. Sarah deflected with a slight smile. "I prefer to focus on the training we're doing here." Tommy nodded but wasn't satisfied. He had sparred with enough people to recognize the difference between sport training and combat training. Sarah's techniques had the kind of ruthless efficiency that spoke of preparation for real violence, not competition. As the class moved into the final phase, Davidson announced that they would end with some light sparring. Touch contact only. "We're working on timing and technique, not trying to knock anybody out." Sarah was paired with Carlos, who approached the exercise with good humor and obvious respect for her skills. They touched gloves and began moving around each other, feeling out timing and distance. What happened next would become part of gym legend. Carlos threw a jab that was slightly off target, the kind of minor mistake that happens in every sparring session. Instead of simply slipping the punch or blocking it, Sarah's response was immediate and devastating in its precision. She slipped left, caught his extended arm in a brief trap, and could have easily followed up with a combination that would have ended the exercise instantly. But it was her restraint that impressed the watching fighters most. She had the opening for a finishing sequence but instead backed away cleanly, resetting the distance and continuing the drill as if nothing unusual had happened. Carlos stopped moving entirely. "What the hell was that?" "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she knew exactly what had caught his attention. "That trap and counter setup. That's not boxing, that's something else entirely." The entire gym had fallen silent. Even people who had been working on other equipment stopped to watch what was happening in the ring. Sarah realized she had made a significant error, allowing muscle memory to take over and responding with techniques that had no place in a boxing gym. Davidson stepped closer to the ring ropes. "Sarah, can you show us that again, slowly?" There was no way to refuse without creating even more suspicion. Sarah nodded and gestured for Carlos to throw the same jab. When he did, she repeated the movement in slow motion, showing how she had trapped his arm and created the opening for a counter that could have been devastating. "That's not pure boxing," Davidson said, his voice carrying a mix of admiration and concern. "That's adapted from something else." "What kind of fighting system uses techniques like that?" Sarah looked around the gym, realizing that her secret was rapidly becoming impossible to maintain. Every face showed curiosity, and some displayed the kind of recognition that came from people who had seen similar techniques before. "It's just something I picked up along the way," she said weakly. "From where?" Tommy asked. "Because I've seen moves like that before, and they weren't in any civilian gym." The atmosphere in the gym had shifted completely. What had started as a routine training session had become an interrogation, with Sarah at the center of unwanted attention. She could feel the walls closing in, her carefully constructed cover beginning to crumble under the weight of her own skills. "Look, I just want to train," she said, pulling off her gloves. "I'm not looking for attention or questions about my background." But it was too late for that approach. Her demonstration had revealed capabilities that went far beyond anything a civilian would normally possess, and the people in Murphy's gym had enough experience to recognize the difference. Davidson studied her face carefully. "Sarah, nobody here is trying to give you a hard time. But what you just showed us raises some serious questions. Those techniques could really hurt someone if used at full speed." "I know that," Sarah replied quietly. "That's why I pulled back. Where did you learn that kind of control? And that kind of technique? Sarah knew she had reached a decision point. She could continue trying to deflect questions, which would only generate more suspicion and make training at the gym impossible. Or she could reveal enough of the truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting the details that really mattered. I had some military training, she said finally, a while ago. The admission sent a ripple of understanding through the watching fighters. Military training explained the precision, the conditioning, and the sophisticated techniques they had witnessed. It also suggested why she might be reluctant to discuss her background in detail.
What branch? Carlos asked with new respect in his voice.
Sarah hesitated again. Navy. It was true, though it barely scratched the surface of her actual service. But it was enough to provide context for her skills without revealing the full extent of her training or the reasons she was now living quietly in a small apartment and trying to blend into civilian life. Combat role? Davidson asked. Something like that. Tommy nodded knowingly. That explains a lot. You guys get some serious hand-to-hand training. Sarah didn't correct the assumption, grateful for any explanation that might end the interrogation. She finished removing her gear and began wrapping her equipment. Will you be back next week? Davidson asked, if that's okay. More than okay. Just remember that we're a boxing gym. Keep those other techniques for when you really need them. Sarah nodded and headed for the door, aware that every person in the gym was watching her leave. The story of the mysterious former military boxer would be all over the local fighting community by morning, adding another layer of attention she couldn't afford. As she walked to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw your workout tonight. We should talk. Hair blood ran cold. The message could have come from anyone in the gym, but the tone suggested something more serious than casual conversation. Someone had been watching her specifically, and they knew more than they were letting on. Sarah deleted the message and drove home in silence, her mind racing through possibilities. Her carefully constructed new life was beginning to unravel, pulled apart by her own inability to completely suppress the skills that had once defined her. The question now was whether she could find a way to maintain her cover while dealing with whoever had sent that message. Back at the gym, conversations buzzed with speculation about Sarah's background and training. The story would spread through the boxing community like wildfire, carrying with it enough details to eventually reach people who might recognize the implications of what they had witnessed. For Sarah Martinez, the simple desire to stay in shape while maintaining a low profile had become the beginning of a much more complicated situation. The skills that had once kept her alive were now threatening the quiet life she had worked so hard to build. The text message haunted Sarah throughout the weekend. She had changed phones twice since leaving her previous life, used cash for everything, and maintained no social media presence. Yet somehow, someone had obtained her number and knew enough about her to send that cryptic message. The implications were deeply troubling. By Monday evening, Sarah had decided not to return to Murphy's gym. The risk was becoming too great, and her performance on Friday had clearly marked her as someone worth investigating. She would find another way to maintain her fitness, something that didn't involve showcasing skills that could lead the wrong people back to her. That Tuesday evening found her sitting in her car outside the gym, torn between caution and the desperate need for the outlet that training provided. The past few days had been filled with restless energy and growing paranoia, her body and mind craving the release that only intense physical activity could provide. The decision was made for her when she spotted a familiar figure approaching the gym's entrance. Marcus Webb, the college student from her first beginner's class, was walking toward the door with his expensive gear bag. But something about his movement caught her attention, a fluidity and awareness that hadn't been present during their previous encounter. Sarah watched more carefully as Marcus entered the gym, noting details she had missed before. His casual scan of the parking lot, the way he positioned himself near the entrance to observe anyone approaching, the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone trained in surveillance techniques. Her blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. Marcus had been too interested in her background, too focused on her technique, for someone who was genuinely struggling with basic boxing fundamentals. His questions had been probing rather than casual, designed to elicit information rather than simple conversation. Sarah realized she had walked into a trap that had been set before she had even entered the gym for the first time. Someone had been expecting her, or at least expecting someone like her, and Marcus had been positioned to identify and assess any person with her particular skill set. The text message suddenly made more sense. It hadn't come from a curious gym member, but from whoever was running the operation that Marcus was part of. They had been watching her, evaluating her capabilities, and now they were ready to make contact. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She scanned the area around the gym, looking for additional surveillance assets or backup personnel. A van parked across the street had been there during her previous visits, she realized now, with different drivers but always maintaining visual contact with the gym's entrance. Her phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. We know you're outside. Come in alone. The situation had moved beyond coincidence or casual interest. This was an organized operation with multiple assets and real-time intelligence capabilities. Sarah's options were limited. She could drive away and abandon this location, knowing they had already identified her vehicle and could track her movements, or she could go inside and confront whatever was waiting for her. She chose confrontation. In her experience, running from a situation like this only delayed the inevitable while giving the opposition more time to prepare. Better to face it head-on while she still had some control over the circumstances. Sarah entered the gym to find it less crowded than usual. Several of the regular fighters were notably absent, and those who remained seemed focused on their individual workouts rather than the usual social atmosphere. Marcus was working a speed bag near the back, his technique significantly better than it had been the previous week. Davidson approached her as she signed in, his manner friendly but with an undercurrent of tension. Glad you came back. There's someone who wants to meet you. Oh? Sarah kept her voice casual while her body prepared for whatever was coming. He's in the office. Says you might know each other from before. Sarah nodded and followed Davidson toward the back of the gym, every sense heightened and alert. The office was a small, cluttered space behind the main training area, filled with paperwork, equipment, catalogs, and photos of fighters from Murphy's long history. The man waiting inside was not someone Sarah recognized, but his bearing and dress immediately identified him as government. Mid-50s, graying hair cut short, the kind of unremarkable appearance that was carefully cultivated to blend in anywhere. His suit was well-tailored but not expensive, his shoes practical rather than stylish. Sarah Martinez, he said as she entered, his voice carrying the flat neutrality of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Or should I say, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, formerly of Naval Special Warfare Development Group.
The use of her real name and former rank hit Sarah like a physical blow.
She had thought her operational identity was buried so deep that it would never surface, protected by layers of classification and need-to-know restrictions that should have made her invisible to anyone outside the highest levels of military and intelligence communities. I think you have me confused with someone else, Sarah replied, though she knew the denial was pointless. Please, Lieutenant, we both know why I'm here. The man gestured to a chair across from Murphy's desk. My name is Agent Harrison, and I represent certain interests within the intelligence community that have been looking for you for quite some time. Sarah remained standing, every instinct telling her to be ready to move quickly. I don't know what you're talking about. Harrison smiled slightly, the expression carrying no warmth. Your performance here over the past 2 weeks has been quite impressive. The way you handled that trap and counter technique was particularly noteworthy. That's advanced SEAL close-quarters combat training, isn't it? The specific reference to SEAL techniques confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or general suspicion. Someone with detailed knowledge of special operations training had been specifically looking for her. What do you want? She asked, abandoning the pretense. Direct. I like that. It's what we always valued about your operational style. Harrison opened a thin folder on Murphy's desk. Your disappearance 3 years ago caused quite a stir in certain circles. One day you were a highly decorated member of DEVG Agru. The next, you had vanished completely. I retired. You went AWOL during a mandatory psychological evaluation following the Kabul incident. That's not retirement, Lieutenant. That's desertion. The mention of Kabul brought back memories Sarah had spent 3 years trying to suppress. The operation had gone wrong in ways that still haunted her nightmares, leading to consequences that had shattered her faith in the system she had served with distinction. The evaluation was a setup, Sarah said quietly. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to bury what happened over there. What happened in Kabul was classified above your clearance level. You weren't supposed to understand the full scope of the operation. I understood enough. Sarah's voice carried the edge that had made her so effective in combat situations. I understood that we had been sent in to clean up someone else's mistake, and that the people giving orders were more concerned with covering their tracks than with the truth. Harrison studied her face carefully. That kind of attitude is exactly why you needed psychological evaluation. The stresses of special operations can create paranoid thinking patterns that interfere with operational effectiveness. Is that what you call it when someone recognizes they're being used as a disposable asset? I call it what it is, a trained killer who went off the reservation and now represents a security risk to ongoing operations. The conversation had shifted from interrogation to threat assessment, and Sarah recognized the implications immediately. Harrison wasn't here to bring her back into the fold or offer her a new assignment. He was here to determine whether she needed to be permanently neutralized. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "That depends on you. Your skills are still valuable, despite your attitude problems. There are opportunities for someone with your capabilities, provided you can demonstrate that you're no longer a security risk." "What kind of opportunities?" Harrison closed the folder. "The kind that would allow you to resume the work you were trained for, under appropriate supervision and with proper incentive structures to ensure loyalty." Sarah understood the offer being made. Return to operational status as a deniable asset, probably for the CIA or another intelligence agency, with the understanding that any future problems would be handled much more permanently than a simple medical evaluation. "And if I decline this generous offer, then we have a problem, Lieutenant. You possess classified knowledge and specialized training that could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. The fact that you've remained inactive for 3 years is encouraging, but it's not a guarantee of future behavior." The threat was clear now. Accept the offer or be eliminated as a security risk. Sarah had expected this moment might come eventually, but she had hoped to have more warning and better options when it did. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Of course. But not too much time. My superiors are anxious to resolve your status one way or another." Harrison stood up and straightened his jacket. "I'll be in touch within the week for your decision." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Lieutenant? Don't consider running again. We found you once, and we're much better at tracking people now than we were 3 years ago." Harrison left the office, and Sarah heard the gym's front door close behind him a few moments later. She remained in the office, processing what had just occurred and its implications for her carefully constructed new life. Davidson appeared in the doorway, his expression sympathetic but wary. "I'm sorry about that. He showed up this afternoon with some kind of federal credentials and said he needed to use the gym to contact you. I didn't feel like I had much choice." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied, "but I think my time training here is probably over." "Because of him?" "Because of what I represent. I should have known better than to think I could just disappear and live a normal life." Davidson leaned against the doorframe. "For what it's worth, I don't know what you did before or what that guy wants with you, but you've conducted yourself with respect and professionalism here. That counts for something." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but she knew that respect and professionalism wouldn't matter if Harrison's superiors decided she was too much of a liability to leave alive. Her options were limited: accept the offer to return to operational status, flee again and hope to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated tracking methods, or find a third option that she couldn't currently see. She left the gym knowing it would be for the last time, her brief experiment in normal civilian life effectively over. The skills that had made her so valuable to the military had also made her impossible to truly retire, marking her as a permanent asset of the intelligence community, whether she wanted to be or not. As Sarah drove home, she noticed the van that had been conducting surveillance was no longer in its usual position. Harrison's people were confident enough in their control of the situation that they no longer felt the need for continuous observation. That confidence might provide an opportunity, but only if she could find a way to exploit it, before they tightened the noose completely. Her phone buzzed one more time. 72 hours, Lieutenant. Choose wisely." Sarah deleted the message and began planning for a future that would require all the skills she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. The quiet life she had built was about to end, one way or another. Sarah spent the next day methodically preparing for what she knew would be her final confrontation with Harrison and his organization. 3 years of civilian life had not dulled her operational planning skills, and the 72-hour deadline provided both pressure and opportunity to force a resolution on her terms rather than theirs. Her small apartment became a command center as she laid out everything she knew about her current situation. Harrison's confidence suggested his team believed they had complete control over her options, but Sarah had spent her active duty career finding ways to turn impossible situations to her advantage. The key was information. Harrison had revealed more than he intended during their conversation, particularly his reference to ongoing operations that her knowledge could potentially compromise. This suggested that the original Kabul incident was part of a larger program, one significant enough that the intelligence community was still actively protecting it. 3 years later, Sarah retrieved the locked case from her bedroom closet, entering the combination that opened her only remaining connection to her former life. Inside were items she had never expected to need again: false identification documents, untraceable communication equipment, and detailed records of every operation she had participated in during her time with Devon Grew. Most importantly, the case contained encrypted copies of the files she had obtained before disappearing from Kabul, the intelligence that had revealed the true nature of the operation she had been sent to cover up, including evidence of unauthorized weapons transfers and the elimination of witnesses who might have exposed the program. Harrison's people had made a critical error in assuming that Sarah's 3-year silence meant she had destroyed or forgotten about the evidence she possessed. In reality, she had been waiting for the right opportunity to use it, hoping that time would eventually provide enough distance from the events to make revelation possible without immediate retaliation. That opportunity had now arrived, forced by Harrison's ultimatum but potentially advantageous because of the pressure he was under to resolve her status quickly. Sarah began by activating communication protocols she had established years earlier with journalists and watchdog organizations, sending carefully crafted messages that would alert them to expect important information within the next 48 hours. The messages were designed to trigger automatic release systems if she failed to check in at regular intervals, ensuring that her death would not silence the evidence she possessed. Next, she reached out to other former Special Operations personnel who had left the military under questionable circumstances. The network was informal but reliable, connected by shared experiences and mutual distrust of the intelligence apparatus they had once served. Within hours, she had confirmation that at least 3 other DEDV GRU veterans had been contacted by government agents in the past month, all with similar ultimatums about their future cooperation. The pattern suggested that Harrison's operation was larger than a single rogue agent attempting to tie up loose ends. Someone at a high level was moving to control or eliminate everyone who had knowledge of the Kabul incident and related operations. Armed with this information, Sarah began planning her response. A direct confrontation with Harrison would be suicide, but she could force him into a position where eliminating her would create more problems than allowing her to disappear permanently. Wednesday evening, Sarah returned to Murphy's gym for what she knew would be her final visit. The atmosphere was different again, with even fewer people present, and a noticeable tension that suggested everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Davidson approached her immediately. "That federal agent was back here today asking more questions about you and your training." "I told him what I told you before. I don't know anything about your background beyond what I've seen here." "I appreciate that," Sarah replied. "But you should know that after tonight I won't be training here anymore. It's not safe for you or your gym to be associated with whatever this is about." "What is this about?" Sarah considered how much to reveal. Davidson had been kind to her, and his gym had provided a brief refuge during a difficult time. He deserved some explanation for the disruption her presence had caused. "I used to work for the government in a capacity that required specialized training. I left that work under circumstances that some people didn't approve of, and now they want me to return to it." "And you don't want to go back?"
"The work I did,
"It changed me in ways that took years to recover from. I'm not the same person who could do those things anymore." Davidson nodded, understanding more than Sarah expected. "I was in Vietnam. Took me a long time to find peace after that. I hope you get the chance to keep yours." "So do I." Sarah changed into her workout clothes one last time, knowing that in a few hours, she would either be dead or free, depending on how well she could execute the plan she had developed. The training session itself was secondary to the real purpose of her visit, but she went through the motions of warming up and working through basic combinations on the heavy bag. At exactly 8:30 p.m., Harrison entered the gym. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other men accompanied him, their bearing and positioning immediately identifying them as security personnel. They spread out to control sightlines and exits, professional but not subtle about their purpose. Harrison approached Sarah directly, no longer bothering with the pretense of a casual conversation. "Time's up, Lieutenant. What's your decision?" Sarah continued working the heavy bag, her punches steady and controlled. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being a security risk. And I think you're right. I am a security risk, but not in the way you imagine." Sarah stopped punching and turned to face Harrison fully. "I know about the weapons transfers in Kabul. I know about the civilians who were eliminated to protect those transfers. And I know that the operation my team was sent to cover up was just one part of a much larger program." Harrison's expression didn't change, but she caught the subtle shift in his body language that indicated heightened alertness. "You're talking about classified operations, Lieutenant. That kind of talk could be considered treason." "Could it?" "Because according to the files I obtained before I disappeared, those operations weren't authorized by any legitimate chain of command. They were being run by a private group within the intelligence community for personal profit. You're delusional. The stress of special operations. Sarah cut him off. I have documentation, Agent Harrison. Names, dates, financial records, communication logs. Everything needed to prove that American special operations personnel were being used to facilitate illegal arms deals that funded unauthorized covert operations. The gym had fallen completely silent. Even the background music had stopped, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the tension between Sarah and Harrison's team. You're bluffing, Harrison said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Am I? Then why are you here? Why is your organization so concerned about a single former SEAL who supposedly went crazy and disappeared? You wouldn't be investing this kind of resources in someone who didn't possess information that could hurt you.
Sarah began moving slowly around the heavy bag, creating distance between herself and Harrison's security personnel while maintaining eye contact with him.
But here's the thing, Agent Harrison. I'm not interested in exposing that information. I just want to be left alone. That's not possible. You know too much. I know exactly enough. Which is why I've arranged for all of that documentation to be released automatically if anything happens to me. Death, disappearance, mysterious accident, sudden illness. Any interruption in my regular check-in schedule triggers an immediate release to multiple news organizations and congressional oversight committees. Harrison's face hardened. You're making a serious mistake, Lieutenant. The mistake was made 3 years ago when your people decided to use special operations personnel to clean up their mess without explaining what we were really doing. You turned us into accessories to murder and arms trafficking, then tried to bury us when we figured it out. Even if what you claim is true, you have no proof that would stand up to scrutiny. Classified documents obtained through illegal means aren't admissible evidence. Sarah smiled for the first time since the conversation began. I'm not planning to take anyone to court, Agent Harrison. I'm planning to take them to the media. Let the court of public opinion decide whether American special operations teams should be used as enforcers for illegal arms deals. The standoff continued for several long moments, Harrison calculating his options while his security team waited for orders. Sarah had positioned herself near the gym's side exit, ready to move, if the situation escalated to violence. Finally, Harrison spoke. What exactly are you proposing? I disappear permanently. New identity, new location, no contact with anyone from my former life. In exchange, the documentation I possess remains classified forever. And if we refuse, then tomorrow morning, major news organizations will receive detailed accounts of American special operations being used to facilitate illegal arms transfers in Afghanistan, along with financial records showing where the profits from those transfers ended up. Harrison was trapped, and he knew it. Killing Sarah would trigger the release of the information he was trying to protect, but allowing her to disappear meant losing control over a significant security risk. How do we know you won't release the information anyway, after you've established your new identity? Because unlike the people you work for, I actually believe in the oath I took to protect and defend the Constitution. I don't want to damage legitimate special operations or hurt people who are just following orders. I just want to live my life without looking over my shoulder. Sarah could see Harrison weighing his options, calculating the risks and benefits of each possible course of action. His security team remained alert but hadn't moved to aggressive positions, suggesting that orders had been given to avoid violence unless absolutely necessary. There would need to be guarantees, Harrison said finally, verification that you've actually destroyed all copies of the documentation you claim to possess. No verification. That's the point of mutual assured destruction. You leave me alone because you can't be sure what I still have, and I leave you alone because I don't want to spend my life fighting ghosts. My superiors won't like the uncertainty. Your superiors created this situation when they decided to use military personnel for illegal operations. Now they get to live with the consequences. Harrison made a decision that Sarah could see forming in his expression. You have 24 hours to disappear. After that, we resume looking for you. Fair enough. But understand that if I see any of your people again anywhere, the deal is off and everything gets released immediately.
Harrison nodded and gestured to his security team.
They moved toward the exit. Their mission fundamentally changed from elimination to damage control. As they reached the door, Harrison turned back one final time. You're making a lot of enemies, Lieutenant. I've been making enemies my entire adult life, Agent Harrison. The difference is that now I get to choose which ones. After they left, Sarah remained in the gym for another hour, working through her emotions and adrenaline with sustained physical activity. The confrontation had gone better than she had hoped, but the real test would come in the following days as she executed her disappearance plan. Davidson approached as she finished wrapping her equipment. That looked intense. It was necessary. Are you really going to disappear? Completely. Sarah Martinez ceases to exist tomorrow. Davidson extended his hand. It's been an honor training with you, even for this short time. I hope you find the peace you're looking for. Sarah shook his hand, genuinely moved by the sentiment. Take care of this place. It's a good gym, and the people here deserve better than to get caught up in government business. She left Murphy's gym for the final time, walking into a night that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The skills that had once made her invaluable to the military were now the tools she would use to disappear completely from the world she had known. 6 months later, Elena Rodriguez walked into a small martial arts studio in a coastal town 300 miles from Murphy's gym. The name was different, the hair was shorter and darker, and subtle changes to her appearance made recognition unlikely even for someone who had known her well. But the movements were unmistakable to anyone trained to notice such things. The studio specialized in mixed martial arts training with an emphasis on practical self-defense rather than competition. It was exactly the kind of environment where someone with Elena's skills could train seriously without drawing the attention that had plagued her previous attempts at maintaining a normal life. The owner, a former Marine named Rodriguez, a coincidence that had amused Elena when she chose her new surname, ran the facility with the kind of professional competence that came from understanding both the technical and psychological aspects of combat training. His students ranged from college kids looking to get in shape to law enforcement personnel maintaining their skills. Elena had spent the intervening months carefully establishing her new identity, using resources and techniques learned during her special operations career to create a background that would withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding the digital footprints that had eventually led Harrison's people to her previous location. The process had been exhausting and expensive, requiring her to abandon everything she had built as Sarah Martinez. But the alternative had been a return to a life of violence, in service to people whose motivations she no longer trusted, or elimination as a security risk. Her apartment in the coastal town was smaller than her previous home, but offered something much more valuable: genuine anonymity. The community was large enough that newcomers didn't attract attention, but small enough that it felt manageable and secure. Most importantly, Elena had found work that utilized her skills without compromising her principles. She had established herself as a freelance security consultant, specializing in personal protection training for executives and their families. The work provided excellent income while allowing her to help people protect themselves rather than serve the interests of shadowy government operations. First time here? Rodriguez asked as she signed the waiver and paid for a trial membership. Yes, I'm new to the area and looking for a place to maintain my conditioning. What's your background? Elena had prepared for this question, crafting an answer that was truthful while obscuring the full scope of her experience. Military, then private security. I'm trying to transition into consulting work. Rodriguez nodded, recognizing the pattern of many veterans who found civilian life challenging but were reluctant to discuss their service in detail. We get a lot of former military here. Good group of people, serious about their training. The evening class was working on ground fighting techniques when Elena joined them. She observed for a few minutes, noting the skill level and training methods before participating in the warm-up exercises. The movements felt familiar and comforting, but without the undercurrent of danger that had characterized her previous attempts at returning to martial arts. When they began working through basic grappling techniques, Elena found herself paired with Maria, a police detective who trained regularly to maintain her tactical skills. Their sparring was technical and controlled, focused on learning rather than domination. You move like you've done this before, Maria commented during a break. A bit, Elena replied, still getting back into it after some time off. Military? Something like that. Maria understood the evasion and didn't press further. In her experience, veterans who were reluctant to discuss their service had usually been involved in operations that didn't translate well to civilian conversation. As the class progressed, Elena allowed herself to demonstrate more of her capabilities while maintaining careful control over the more specialized techniques that would have raised questions. She sparred with several partners, working at their level rather than imposing her own, helping them improve their technique through careful guidance rather than overwhelming them with superior skill. Rodriguez watched her work with growing interest. After class, he approached her with an offer that would change the trajectory of her new life. I've been looking for someone to help teach the women's self-defense classes, he said. You have excellent technique and good teaching instincts. Would you be interested in some part-time instruction work? Elena considered the offer carefully. Teaching would require her to be more visible and develop relationships within the community, both potential risks to her carefully maintained anonymity. But it would also provide legitimate reasons for her skills and a way to contribute positively to other people's lives. What kind of self-defense classes? Practical stuff. Basic awareness, simple techniques that work under stress, how to get away from dangerous situations. A lot of the women who come here aren't interested in becoming fighters. They just want to feel more confident about protecting themselves. Elena thought about the women she had known during her military career, many of whom had struggled with feeling safe in environments where physical strength and aggression were valued above other qualities. The opportunity to help other women develop confidence and practical skills appealed to her more than she had expected. "I'd like to try it," she said. Rodriguez smiled. "Great. We can start with one class a week and see how it goes." Over the following months, Elena's life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time since she had left the military. Her consulting work provided financial security, while her teaching responsibilities connected her to a community of people who respected her skills without needing to know their origin. The women's self-defense classes became particularly rewarding. Elena found that her experience in high-stress situations translated well to teaching others how to remain calm and focused when faced with potential threats. She emphasized awareness and avoidance over confrontation, but ensured that her students understood how to fight effectively if escape became impossible. One evening, Elena was working with a group of college students when a situation arose that reminded her why she had been so valuable to the special operations community. A young woman named Jessica had been struggling with the physical techniques, her natural reaction to aggression being to freeze rather than respond. "I don't think I can do this," Jessica said after failing to execute a simple escape technique for the third time. "I'm just not strong enough." Elena recognized the problem immediately. Jessica was thinking about the techniques as physical confrontations rather than tactical situations, focusing on her perceived weaknesses rather than understanding how to create advantages. "Strength isn't the primary factor in most dangerous situations," Elena explained to the group. "Speed, timing, and surprise are much more important. The goal isn't to win a fight, it's to create an opportunity to escape." She demonstrated by having one of the larger students attempt to grab her from behind. Instead of trying to overpower him, Elena used his momentum and positioning against him, creating an opening that allowed her to break free and move to a position of tactical advantage. "See how I didn't fight his strength?" she asked the class. "I redirected it." Most attackers expect resistance in a predictable direction. When you respond differently than they expect, you create confusion that can be exploited. Jessica tried the technique again, this time focusing on movement and timing rather than strength. The difference was immediately apparent, her escape clean and effective. "That felt completely different," Jessica said with surprise, "because you stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like someone who refuses to be controlled." Elena replied. The class continued with renewed energy, the students beginning to understand that self-defense was more about mindset and tactics than physical capability. Elena found herself drawing on lessons learned during her military training, adapting combat psychology to civilian self-protection. After class, Rodriguez approached Elena with obvious satisfaction. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone teach those concepts so effectively. You have a real gift for this." "I've had good teachers," Elena replied. "Military instructors?" Elena hesitated, then decided that a partial truth was better than continued evasion, among others. "I've been in situations where those skills made the difference between life and death." Rodriguez nodded respectfully. "It shows in how you teach. You understand the psychological aspects as well as the physical ones." Elena's success as an instructor led to additional opportunities. She began teaching specialized classes for law enforcement personnel, sharing techniques for managing dangerous situations without escalating them unnecessarily. Her military experience provided credibility, while her careful avoidance of specific details about her service maintained the mystery that helped protect her identity. More importantly, the work felt meaningful in a way that her previous military service had not toward the end. Instead of serving political agendas that she didn't fully understand, Elena was helping ordinary people develop skills that might save their lives or the lives of others. The closest thing to detection came 8 months after her disappearance from Sarah Martinez's life. A man with military bearing attended one of her law enforcement classes, his questions more probing than those of typical students. Elena recognized the signs of a background investigation, but maintained her cover identity while subtly gathering information about her observer. After class, she confronted him directly in the parking lot. "Federal agent or military intelligence?" The man was surprised by her directness but didn't deny the implication. Just checking on someone who might be of interest to certain parties. And your assessment? Elena Rodriguez appears to be exactly what she claims to be, a former military member who has successfully transitioned to civilian consulting work.
No evidence of any security concerns or unauthorized activities.
Elena understood that this was Harrison's organization conducting a final verification that she was honoring their agreement. The investigator's conclusion would determine whether she continued to live freely or faced renewed pressure to return to government service. Good to know, she said simply. The investigator left without further conversation, and Elena never saw him again. She had passed the test, demonstrating that she had indeed disappeared completely from her former life while maintaining her end of the bargain regarding classified information. 2 years after leaving Murphy's gym, Elena had built a life that combined the skills she had developed during her military career with the peace she had sought since leaving that world behind. Her consulting business had grown to include corporate security assessments and executive protection training, while her teaching responsibilities had expanded to include workshops for domestic violence survivors and personal safety seminars for various organizations. Most importantly, she had found a way to use her capabilities to help others without compromising her principles or serving agendas that she couldn't support. The strength that had once made her valuable to the military establishment now provided security and independence that no government organization could threaten. On quiet evenings, Elena sometimes thought about the people she had known at Murphy's gym and wondered if they ever discussed the mysterious woman who had appeared briefly in their community before vanishing again. She hoped they remembered her as someone who had trained with respect and professionalism rather than as a source of disruption and danger. The skills that had once defined her identity as Lieutenant Sarah Chen now served a different purpose entirely. Instead of being weapons in service to others' objectives, they had become tools for building the life she wanted to live, protecting the freedom she had fought so hard to achieve. Elena Rodriguez was everything that Sarah Martinez had hoped to become, and everything that Lieutenant Chen had never been allowed to be. A person whose strength served her own principles rather than the interests of others. In learning to box, she had inadvertently revealed her past, but in confronting that past, she had finally gained control over her future. The woman who had once been trained to be an invisible weapon had learned to become visibly strong on her own terms, teaching others to find their own strength while maintaining the anonymity that allowed her to live without fear. It was, she reflected, perhaps the most successful mission she had ever completed.